everyone, and welcome to all of you who are attending this webinar. I was asked to speak about corneal topography, mainly the Pentacam, but in order to get there, we have to go through some of the preceding technology as well. So I'll try and keep this brief. I understand that this is largely a PG forum. So basically, topography comes from the study of the Earth's contours. We know that the Earth's shape includes a lot of hills, mountains, valleys. So it's a lot of differing terrain. And the word topography means basically recording or taking notes of the contours of a particular place. So we just extrapolate that to the cornea as well. And although the cornea has a much smaller real estate, maybe about 11 to 12 millimeters diameter, a small little circle, the study of the changes of its contours is equally interesting to us. And we're going to really basically talk about that today in the next 15 or 20 minutes that's been given to me. So the issues that we're going to look at essentially are, how do we look at the cornea? And if you want to study its contours, what are the principles involved? So basically there's curvature of the cornea, there's elevation of the cornea, and there's power of the cornea. So how do we use different instrumentation to look at these parameters of the cornea? What are the maps that result from this evaluation, and how do we interpret them? And of most interest to us today, when we are planning some kind of refractive surgical procedure on the cornea, how can we use this information to screen the patient and make sure that the surgery is safe and effective? So let's start by looking at the cornea itself, because that is the focus of our interest for this evening. So as we know, the cornea is not a spherical structure, and that is the first thing to understand. Basically, it is what is called a prolate ellipse, meaning that it is steeper in the center and flatter in the periphery, as you can see from those circles that have been drawn. So the smaller circle means that the cornea is steeper. That means that there's a shorter radius of curvature. And in the periphery where the cornea is flatter, we get a larger circle here, and therefore the radius of curvature is larger. So the prolate shape ellipse is also called a positive shape factor because the radius of curvature increases from the center to the periphery. Now we know from our Gaussian optics that the cornea is basically surrounded by different optical media. There is air in the front with a refractive index of 1. The corneal tissue itself has a refractive index of 1.376, and posterior to the cornea is the aqueous, which has a refractive index of 1.336. But the cornea, as we know, has two structures, the anterior and the posterior layer. And the sum of the corneal power is the sum of these two powers. The front surface has a positive refraction of plus 49. The back surface has a negative refraction of about -6. And therefore, this gives you the total corneal power, which is around 43 to 44 diopters in a normal eye. We have traditionally used the keratometer to study the corneal curvature, and this is still valid today. And a lot of the initial designs that looked at corneal topography, the machines, were modeled on the corneal keratometer itself. This is something that all of us are taught in our basic training days. The corneal curvature is measured by the keratometer using these two Myers, and basically you cornea, and based on the size of the reflection, we derive the corneal curvature. The prism doubles these images so that when you match these two, you can get the power or the curvature of the cornea on the two meridians, the vertical and the horizontal. But very quickly, people realized when we started doing refractive surgery, when we needed to look at the entire cornea, that the keratometer had limitations. It does not measure the peripheral cornea. It works around 3 millimeters in the corneal center. It assumes that the astigmatism is orthogonal. It does not work very well with oblique astigmatism or irregular astigmatism. And depending on the curvature of the cornea, if you have a very steep cornea, it mirrors a very small image. Therefore, you measure less than 3 millimeters. And if you have a very flat cornea, it measures a larger image, and therefore you get larger than 3 millimeters. And you don't measure the apex itself. You're measuring the 3 millimeter alone. But despite all of these drawbacks, it has worked very well. And even today, it works very well, particularly if you want to do a toric IOL and you want to look at astigmatism. The keratometer is still an extremely good device. And this works because in most normal eyes, the central cornea is close to a sphere. And all of the assumptions of the keratometer work very well when you're working in the small 3 millimeter zone of the central cornea in a normal eye. It is when you want to look at the periphery of the cornea, or when you have certain abnormalities in the central cornea, that the keratometer doesn't do well. And that is why once we started doing corneal refractive surgery, when we needed to look at the periphery and we started changing the center, we needed devices that looked at more area of the cornea and did so with a different approach. So this is exactly how the Meyers will look when you reflect them off a cornea. Smaller central Meyers because of the steeper cornea and rounder Meyers in the periphery. And if there is any astigmatism, wherever the cornea is steeper, the Meyers tend to get compressed and you get this kind of an oval shape. So just remember this because we're going to use this in the early topographers. So as I keep saying, we were measuring the curvature with the keratometer, and what we as clinicians use is the power. So when we want to get the power of the corneal surface, we have to derive it from the measured radius of curvature, and we use this basically by using the Snell's law of refraction. And this states basically that if you have the refractive index of the cornea, you subtract from it the refractive index of air because the light is coming in this way, and you divide it by the radius of curvature in meters of the anterior corneal surface. And in this example, the corneal refractive index is this. This is the refractive index of air. And if the anterior radius of curvature of the cornea is this, you get a power of about 48 diopters. Now, this is not what the keratometer will show you for this particular curvature, because we are actually having to look at the back of the cornea as well. We know that the back of the cornea is minus. All you're measuring with the keratometer is the anterior surface, but when you convert that, we need to get the power of the whole cornea. And this is a very important concept that you must understand, because a lot of the topographers also work on the same principle. So when you're measuring only the anterior radius of curvature, but you're trying to derive the power of the total cornea, what the machine does, it cheats. Instead of using the true index of refraction of the cornea, which is 1.376, it uses something called the effective refractive index, which is mostly 1.3375 for most of the manufacturers. And by doing that, we are trying to account for the posterior corneal surface. So let me show you what happens when I substitute this value for 1.376 in the same equation. So now you'll see that the power of the cornea is 43 or 44 diopters, which is what we want, because this minus 6 is now accounted for. So remember this particular approximation that most keratometers do. Once we realized that we needed to look at a larger area of the cornea, we needed to go beyond the keratometer. So we did keratoscopy, which means you have basically a lighted Placido's disc, if you will. So this projects multiple circles onto the cornea, and then you get a larger area of the cornea that you can image. From then, we went on to raster stereography, interferometry, both of which are no longer used to study the cornea. But what has stood the test of time is the slit scanner. And now, of course, the newer device, the Scheimpflug, which is the pentacam that we're interested in, we're getting there slowly. So when you look at these Placido-based devices, you have two broad designs. You have the large object devices and the small object devices, the cones, basically. You can have either a large cone or a small cone. There are pros and cons for both of these. The small cone basically tries to avoid the problem of the patient nose because it goes very close to the patient's eye, and therefore you get a larger corneal coverage, which is more complete because the nose doesn't interfere. But because you're so close to the cornea, it has focusing errors, and therefore you must focus more precisely. So this is what I meant. If you have a large cone, the nose can come in the way, and so basically, these are nothing but glorified keratometers with a computer attached. So the same principle that I told you earlier for the keratometer works here. So we look at the smallest circle that has been formed by the topographer. These are broken down into 180 small segments of arc. The radius of curvature of each of these is computed. It's averaged, and that gives you the radius of curvature of the cornea at this point. Based on the distance of the second ring from the first ring, the radius of curvature of that area is computed, and so on. From here, we get power by using the same approximation in terms of the keratometer of 1.3375. And this radius of curvature map is converted also to a power map. And because there's a powerful computer attached, all of this is really real time, and you can get it at the click of a button. Now, two important aspects of these maps that you must understand is there's something called the axial curvature on a topographic map, the Placido-based device. What this is a point is dragged back to the principal curvature ray, and therefore there is some kind of a normalization that occurs. Each point is supposed to relate to the point next to it, and therefore the map that you get will be an average map which is quite uniform. As opposed to this, you can have what is called the tangential or instantaneous curvature, where each point is treated individually, and therefore that particular point is not necessarily dragged back to the central ray, and therefore that steep area, the bulge on the cornea, will be depicted as it is. What is the relevance in terms of practical significance? This is how it looks. This is the same cornea. When you look at it with the axial map, you see a very smooth, uniform pattern because the points are averaged and each one takes into account the point next to it. Whereas if you're doing the instantaneous map, each individual point is looked at in its true entity as a true entity, and therefore you get a lot more distortion on the map or a lot more detail on the map, whichever way you choose to look at it. You get a slightly more irregular appearance. So you can look at this as the low power and this is the high power of a microscope. Most people tend to use the axial maps on a routine basis because this is what we like to see, uniform maps. But if there's a particular area of interest and you would like to see more detail, then you can go on to the instantaneous mode. It's the same image capture. It's just the way the computer interprets the data. So on the same image, you can get both this and that at the click of a button. The other thing that you must remember is to look at the scale of the topographic map. So this is something called the absolute scale, which was devised by Stephen Kleiss. So it goes from 9 diopters all the way up to 101.5 diopters, and all of these colors each depicts a certain range. Most normal corneas will be in the greens and sometimes in the yellows. Anything less than green, the blues, means the cornea is flatter than normal, and the oranges and red means that the cornea is steeper than normal. This is the absolute scale. You can see a nice uniform representation. Again, just like the instantaneous map, if you want more detail, you can use what is called the normalized scale, which is seen on the right side. So here the machine takes the lowest power of that particular cornea, which is 43 diopters. It takes the highest power of that cornea, which is 46 diopters, and uses this range of colors to go from 43 to 46. So you can see more colors on the map. You can see more detail on the map. But this will change from each time you take a picture. This will keep changing. So you cannot compare images that are taken on the normalized scale. But like the high zoom, in a particular cornea, if you want to look at this area in more detail, you can obviously see the range of power changes that are happening here. So these are some things that you must remember. These are basic. The next property of normal corneas is something called mirror image symmetry or enantiomorphism. So if you take the right eye and the left eye, the map side by side, and if I take a fold down the middle of the paper here and fold it on each other, the two maps should align. In keratoconus, one of the early things that change is this enantiomorphism. The symmetry is lost. So in a keratoconic pair of eyes, the two eyes will not be symmetric, and when you fold, they will not overlap each other like in this example. So this is obviously keratoconus. So this is the inferotemporal area of steepening of the left eye. So you can see the red color telling you that the power here is much more. So this is pattern recognition. So most of us, when we look at an image like this, are primed to think of keratoconus. So in order to help the clinician, these topographic devices introduce certain automated indices. So these are basically algorithms that are used by the machine because it's a computer to help you decide what is the possible similarity in appearance of that particular map to a keratoconus. The earliest index was the Rabinowitz index. So basically, he looked at the central keratometry. He also looked at what he called the eye steepening. So superior minus superior, it will be a positive number. In a normal cornea, where things are about the same, superior and inferior, the value should be close to 6. He also looked at the difference in the keratometry between the two eyes because we know there is asymmetry. He put all this together and he came up with an index which tells you what is the similarity of appearance of the map that you're looking at with that of keratoconus. So in an early keratoconus, as you can see here, with some kind of a small amount of steepening in one eye and a frank keratoconus in the other eye, the machine, you may pick this up, but you may mix this if you're not being careful. The machine might help you pick it up. The second index was the Kleiss-Maida index. They did the same thing by looking at a lot of other indices. The other term that we use is something called the SRA-X, which is the skewing of the radial axis of astigmatism. In a normal eye, if you look at an astigmatism, a bow tie will be very symmetrical, superior and inferior. In a keratoconus, the bow tie tends to become more skewed. It starts to fall off the central vertical meridian. When this degree of change is more than 21 degrees, we think it is suspicious of keratoconus. And Rabinowitz came up with an evolution of his design. So basically, he called it the KISA index. K stands for keratometry, I minus S is what I already told you. SRAX is what I told you before, which is the skewing of the axis. And the regular astigmatism index is given by the K1 minus K2 in two keratometric values that you get. So you put all of this together and come up with one number. If this number is less than 60, it is believed to be normal. If it is more than 100, it is believed to be abnormal. And between 60 and 40, 60 and 100, it's thought to be suspicious. So that is how these automated indices work. But as far as placido-based keratometers are concerned, they have some limitations. There are multiple designs. Many manufacturers each uses some standard of its own. And most importantly, it depends on a reference axis. So the patient looks into the device where the rings are placed in the cone, and the axis of the device and the visual axis must align for you to get a proper representation of the cornea. The Mayas are reflected from the tear film. So if you have a poor tear film, you can have poor reflections and tear film artifacts. And basically, these are based on simplified optics with no measurements between rings. So there are some blank spaces which the machine extrapolates and fills in. So you get a uniform appearance, even though it's not measuring each and every point on the cornea. So this is the point I was making. So some of us have a fixation axis which is not perfectly aligned. You might have a large angle kappa. So when these people look at a machine, they are not aligning their line of sight with the line of fixation of the machine's cone. And when this happens, you can get an inferior radial steepening. So this is the keratocone. This is the bow tie astigmatism, which is a normal line, if it is aligned. If the patient's visual axis is not aligned with that of the machine, then the same astigmatism or the same bow tie will look like an inferior steepening. And this is very dangerous because these eyes generally are ruled out of corneal refractive surgery. Most of us would not touch these. And if this occurs because of some fallacy on the part of the keratometer, then you may be falsely excluding somebody who could otherwise have a procedure. The slit scanning, the elevation-based devices, the Shameflugs and the slit scanners do not have this fallacy. So as you can see here, the Placido is showing an inferior steepening, but both the anterior and the posterior elevation maps are not showing that steepening because they do not depend upon this line of sight concept to get their data. And so this is one of the deficiencies of Placido-based topographers that the elevation-based devices can overcome. The other reason for needing elevation is because we slowly realize that if you look at this cartoon, the curvature from A to B and the curvature from C to D is exactly the same. But obviously, in terms of elevation, they are not the same. So the cornea can be depressed or elevated, but can have the same curvature at these 2 points. And as we went further into corneal refractive surgery, this distinction became important. And therefore, the concept of elevation along with that of curvature came into vogue. So this brought in the concept of corneal tomography and not topography, which is what we've been talking about all along. So when we talk about tomography, we are looking at maps that are variations in the elevation of the cornea. We're also looking at curvature, but here we're adding elevation data. And most importantly, we are now looking at the posterior surface, which the topographers based on Placido technology could not do. So this was done initially by the slit scanning topographers and now by the Shameflug tomographers. The first prototype of this looking at elevation was the OpScan. So basically, I'm sure most of you have seen it. It gets about 40 light slits which go from one side of the cornea to the other and then go back again. And then it gets about 240 points per split. And this was the first time we could look at the posterior realize that otherwise they could not align the data from the slits. So here, in addition to the anterior surface, posterior surface, that can look at, we can look at the anterior chamber depth, we can look at white to white diameter. And when it first came out, it was a very useful tool. I believe it's still used by a lot of people, but it also has certain problems. Now, when we talk about elevation, just like we talked about topography, the axial, the instantaneous, and so on, we must understand one basic concept at the start about elevation. This is a picture of Mount Everest. I didn't know its height. I had to look it up on the internet. This is 8,848 meters. But 8,848 meters in relation to what? So we always say elevation on the earth is in relation to sea level, the mean sea level. So based on that, there is something that is elevated. So remember that when we're going to go back to talk about the cornea. So if you have a cornea in blue traced like this, when you look at the elevation data, be it a Shameflug or a slit scanner, because it's capturing the elevation of these corneal data points in space, all you'll get is a set of points. In order to make sense of this data in a way that we can use it meaningfully, we must compare it to a reference surface. Just like the height of the Everest is in comparison to the sea level, here we need what is called a reference sphere, which is this thin black line here. And once you derive this reference surface, then these points will make sense. So some of the points will be above the reference surface, which are elevated. They are called the peaks. And some of them are below the reference surface. These are depressed, and these are called the valleys. So only in comparison to a reference sphere does elevation data make sense. This reference sphere is computed by the machine by using some algorithm. So what it tries to do is to tries to keep this reference surface as close to all of the data points as possible. Now remember this particular concept, because when we want to look at pentacam interpretation of corneal curvature and looking at keratoconus, this will become important. So when you draw a reference sphere, there are two concepts. There's something called the float and the no float method. In a float method, basically the reference sphere does not have any particular relevance, or we're not pinning it to the corneal surface. We leave them to float independent of each other, and then we derive the data. Whereas in the no float method, we are basically pinning it at one point. As you said, we can pin it at the apex, we can pin it in both the apex and the center, whichever we want. The importance of this being that if you do the float method, as opposed to the no float method on the right of the screen, you get more data in the float method, and most machines by default will use the float method. Because these are powerful computers, you can always go and change the setting to make it a no float, but by default it is float because you tend to get more data from this aspect. Now, this is how the screen from one of these elevation-based devices will look. It is typically called a quad map. You can change the orientation of this. You can put 6 on it. You can put 2 on it. You can put only 1 on it. But by default, most of us like to look at the anterior elevation of the anterior corneal surface. We like to look at the elevation of the posterior corneal surface. We can look at the Placido this is from an op scan. So you can see the Placido is missing data on the top and the bottom, which won't happen with your pentacams and the other Schoenflug devices. And you can also look at pachymetric maps of the cornea. So these are the 4 things that we look at on a typical quad map from an elevation device: anterior surface elevation, posterior surface elevation, the corneal topography like a Placido, and the pachymetric map of the entire cornea. Now, the reason why the op scan has limitations and why the pentacam and similar devices came into vogue is because the op scan takes a bit of time, close to a minute, to obtain the measurements. And if you have saccadic movements of the eye, then the slits are difficult to align. You can get one slit here, and it goes up and down. And therefore, it becomes very hard to align. And even though they realized that they needed a Placido because of the construction of the device, you can't have a circular Placido because it interferes with the slit. So they had to make it an oblong kind of a Placido, which means you're missing data superiorly and inferiorly. And because the slit images the posterior corneal surface through the anterior corneal surface, the magnification of the posterior corneal surface is affected by the magnification of through the anterior surface. So if you have a distorted cornea, this doesn't do particularly well. The data on the posterior surface, which is considered very important, tends to become a little iffy. And the pachymetry, the machine consistently overestimated. So normally we use a 0.92 correction on the op scan to get the pachymetry. So whatever it measures, we take 92% of that because that is what helps align it with ultrasonic pachymetry. To overcome this, we finally came to the Schoenflug devices, which we're using now. So this is, the pentacam is one of these. There's another one called the Sirius, which I personally use. And there's another one called the Galili. And I'll tell you the differences between the two. We'll talk about the pentacam and the Sirius more. Principle, they use oblique tangents rotating camera, and you can get about 30,000 points. In the HD version, you can get even more on the pentacam. So if you take a basic standard SLR camera, which you're all used to, you just hold and click. Normally, the object plane, the image plane, and the lens plane of the camera are all aligned, which is common sense. You have shooting something in front of me, so my eye, the camera lens, and the object are all in the same plane. But if you think of this as the eye, basically you find the cornea here, the tissues behind, the iris, and so on. So there's a focus issue with this system. If you focus on the cornea, the iris will not be in particularly good focus, and vice versa. So if you wanted to overcome this and look at the entire cornea, the anterior and posterior surface in good focus, basically one of the ways which Theodor Schoenflug was an Austrian military engineer, he came up with this idea, was to basically tilt the plane of the image plane in the camera. So basically, when you tilted that, you could get different layers of the object system into perfect focus, unlike with an SLR system. And this is called the Schoenfeld principle, which these devices use. So you have a rotating camera which goes around the limbus, so it's cutting arcs of the cornea as it goes around. And the other important thing of this is that the center of the cornea can be used as a fixation point for these multiple cuts that are made. So you can align all of the images much better, which we could not do with a slit lamp. So it's a blue light emitting diode with a CCD for image capture. And most of these are basically using high-end statistics to tell you data about the cornea. So basically all of this data that we get, anterior, posterior, everything, what it does is it compares it with normative data. And whenever the data from your particular data set in that eye starts to deviate away from the normal, we say that it is abnormal, and that is how we detect problems on the cornea. So these are the same things that it does like the slit lamp, the anterior and posterior surface pachymetry and aberrometry. The same quad map that you can see, this is from the Sirius. The same concept of enantiomorphism will work with elevation data as well. So these are Placido maps. These are the elevation maps of the same eye. You can see that the same concept of folding the paper in the middle on itself, these two maps of astigmatism will also overlap. So the enantiomorphism holds good here as well. Now, this is the famous pentacam map that we all look at, and this is the one that causes a lot of problems in terms of interpretation. There's a number of points of information on this, and we'll have to try and understand how exactly to use this. So the first thing basically is this particular map on the left side. So we see these three pairs of data here. What is it? This is called the Bellin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia display, or the BAD display. And everybody has some confusion in understanding what this is. So basically, let me just use a cartoon to try and explain what this means. So what Bellin and Ambrosio said was that if you have a keratoconus and this cartoon represents that, there's a bump in the cornea here, we would like to pick it up very easily. So even if it's a very minor bump, the idea of the BAD display is to help you detect it as a clinician. So let us say that the base cornea is 44 diopters, and in this example, the cone is 48 diopters. It's 4 diopters steeper. When the machine wants to look at these elevation data, it draws what is called a best fit sphere. And I told you in the beginning that the purpose of this sphere is to stay as close to all the constituent points as possible. So in this crude example, we will say that it is 46. It wants to stay as close to 48 and 44 as possible. So it's about 46. So in the context of this reference sphere, the bump is now 2 diopters elevated. So when you look at the map, it will show you that there's a 2 diopter elevation. Now, what they want to do is to magnify this for you. So in the automated system of picking it up, they want to enhance this detection process. So what they did, they looked at the thinnest point on that particular cornea, which you suspect has keratoconus, and the apex of the cone is the thinnest point. So you draw a circle around 4 millimeters around it. And because all of this is computer-based electronic data, it is very easy to do whatever you want with the data. So they took that thinnest point, which is technically the apex of the cone, and circle 4 millimeters around it. You just delete the data from the map. So that is what they did. So they deleted the bump. Now you recalculate your best fit sphere, and because the only points that are there on the map are 44, your best fit sphere will now be 44. After you've calculated the new best fit sphere, you bring the data that you erased back onto the map, and then you do your comparison now. And now in comparison to this best fit sphere, you get a 4 diopter bump instead of the previous 2 diopter bump. Everything is magnified and you can pick this up, and this is all the BAD display is. So this is basically the original data around the point has been rubbed out. And this is the subtraction maps from the two. So this is a normal cornea. In a normal cornea, you won't see any difference basically. So this works when you have some kind of abnormality. Any doubts? Better than I can. So when Bellin and Ambrosio first did this, this is one of the from their own original paper. They wanted to highlight why this was important. So this is a cornea, which is about 500 microns in central thickness. And as you can see in the last subtraction map, there is nothing wrong. Everything looks normal. Whereas in this cornea, which was 536 microns in thickness in the center, the display shows when you subtract, you elevate the highlighting the area of elevation in the central cornea. So this was keratoconus. So they said if you just go by cornea, thick cornea is normal, thin cornea is keratoconus, we could be at fault. And they explained why their method of manipulating the data helps us pick this up a little better. So this is one aspect of it. So now we have to look at the other aspect of it, the right side of the map. So what does all this data mean? So the two things that we look at, again, like I told you, all this is doing is it's taking your set of data from that particular patient's eye and it's comparing it to normative data from the normal population. And whenever your data goes beyond or below this normal distribution, we tend to think it is abnormal. So one of the things that they look at is something called the corneal thickness spatial profile, or CTSP, which is nothing but the progressive thickening of the cornea from the thinnest point to the periphery. If you think about it, in a normal cornea, basically the center is typically the thinnest point. It's around 500 to 520 microns, and then it thickens all the way out to the periphery where it goes to between 700 to 750 microns. So there is a very gradual rate of increase in thickness from the center to the periphery. But imagine now in a keratoconic cornea, the thinnest point is not at the center, it is more in the infratemporal periphery. And the thinnest point can go down to 400, 380, 420, something like that. So from there to the peripheral 720, there is a much more rapid increase in the thickness profile. So that is all this is trying to detect. And what we are seeing here, these two lines are the 95% confidence intervals plus 2 standard deviation and minus 2 standard deviation. In an abnormal cornea, it will tend not to follow the normal pattern. So this is about the CTSP. The second thing is the percentage thickness increase on the pentacam or the PTI. So again, instead of looking at the change in thickness, it's looking at the percentage change in thickness. So basically, we're using pachymetric data on the right. We're using the elevation of curve, the power data on the left. So this thickness increase in percentage again will be different in a keratoconic cornea because, like I said, the thinnest point is no longer in the center and it's much thinner than normal. So the percentage increase will change. So if this does not conform to the normal, you can have problems. The same thing is here in another way. They're looking at the progression index in terms of the progression value. So these are the three things that you can see. The next thing that you look at is these 5 little boxes on the bottom. So these are the standard deviations from normal. Anything which is more than 1.6 times deviated, that's more than 1 standard from the mean is considered abnormal. So the first one refers to the change in the front surface data. The second one refers to the back surface data. How far is it from the normal? How far deviated is it from the normal? The third one is the pachymetric progression. The fourth D is basically the thinnest point. Where is it? And the last one is the displacement of this thinnest point. First one is how thin is the thinnest point, and the next one is how far is it from the center. So these are the 5 data that they can look at. And the last box here, the one composite D, is a composite measurement of all of these values. And again, here it is color coded. So even if you didn't understand a word of what I said in the last 3 or 4 minutes about this slide, all you have to do is to look at this last D. And if the machine highlights it in yellow, there is something suspicious about that cornea. If the machine highlights it in red, then it is an abnormal corneal use. Now, the Sirius machine that I use, and if some of you are exposed to it, it does pretty much the same thing. It looks at the vertical asymmetry here. So basically of the tangential curvature map. So this is similar to the I minus S that I told you about in the early Rabinowitz data. And the way it looks at it is it gives you a color bar. So when you end up in the green, it is normal. When you end up in the yellow, it is suspicious. And like here, if your value is in the red, it is abnormal. It also looks something little more than the pentacam does. One aspect of it that the Sirius does, it looks at aberrometry of the cornea. It looks at the BCA index, Baiocchi, Calosi, Versassi index, which is a composite of 5 aberrometry values. And again, it weights it to the coma axis. And if this is deviated from the normal, then it tends to believe that the cornea could have keratoconus because the keratoconic cornea has more aberrations than a normal cornea. And then if you come to this box here below, it looks basically at pachymetric data here, which is shown here, just like the pentacam did. It looks at the maximum keratometry here, both the front and the back. It looks at the maximum elevation data here, front and the back, and also looks at the vector, and that is what is shown here in the middle. So if you can look at it, this is your vector. If the vector ends up within this area, it is normal. If the vector ends up in the yellow zone here, it is suspicious. And if it ends up all the way in the red, it is abnormal. and how abnormal it is will show you depending on how far into the red it goes. So this is basically the final composite vector, the summary vector on the series. So even if we don't really look at all of these nuances ourselves, the machine tries to make our life easier by giving you these composite vectors. The Cassini is a Placido-like device, but it gives you a lot of colored points, the green, the yellow, and the red. And in a black and white image that most of the normal Placidos do, if there are two rings and if they're touching each other, then you don't know whether the point here belongs to this ring or that ring in an abnormal cornea. The Cassini apparently can deal with that because of the color coding, so you can know where it comes from, although this is only for the anterior surface. Some of the recent developments are to use the Corvus, which gives you the corneal biomechanics. And again, Ambrosio has come up with what he calls the TBI, or the tomographic biometric index. So what it does basically is the tomographic biomechanic index combines data from the pentacam, looks at all of the parameters we just saw from the corneal thickness, the corneal curvature, power, and so on and so forth. And it also looks at the corneal hysteresis and the corneal shape deformational data from the Corvus. You put both of these together in the computer algorithm, you come up with a composite index, and this is believed to increase the ability to detect a cornea at fault, because keratoconic corneas also have basically some biomechanical changes, so they are not as rigid as normal corneas, and the Corvus can have certain parameters like corneal stiffness, resistance factor, and so on, which helps you pick it up. The other way we can do this also, which is coming up, is to look at epithelial mapping using ultra-high frequency ultrasound, and devices like the Sirius, the MS39, which has both the anterior segment, the OCT, as well as the Scheimpflug, can look at both of the data. And the reason is that in keratoconic eyes, because the epithelium is a corneal surgeon's friend and is trying to normalize the contour, the epithelium becomes very thin at the apex of the cone and it thickens at the base of the cone. So this is something called the donut shape. And by incorporating this data along with your tomographic data from the Scheimpflug, again, we believe we can increase our ability to pick up corneas that are looking at topography in the context of a normal eye exam. Is it necessary? I don't think so. So you don't need to do topography for everybody who walks into your clinic. If you're a corneal surgeon like me, if you're doing corneal transplants, and of course corneal topography will help you, because if I do a graft like this and if I end up with astigmatism like this, the patient's not going to see well. I can help him by removing sutures along the steep area here to help the corneal astigmatism reduce. And here even a Placido-based topography should suffice. But if you're doing radial keratotomy, if an eye like this comes to you and you need to do some cataract surgery, or if you want to do corneal refractive surgery where you want to look at the shape of the entire cornea, including the posterior surface, then I guess we must use corneal tomography. And today we typically use the Scheimpflug. So a word of caution, I'm not a physicist, I'm not an optics person. So basically I try and use the experts, what they tell me to for my patients. Because if you do topography all the time, and if you get too much into the detail, then everything can look like this. So this looks like a pretty girl lying on her side when you're looking at mountains. So don't get that deep into topography, but definitely do understand the basics so that you can use it rationally and wisely in your patients to help them, particularly when you're screening them for LASIK. Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you, Professor Rao sir, for wonderful talk. And there are few questions. One from Sasi sir. Can you ask questions for Rao sir?
You can take that question. This one Rajiv has put up, that what is the use of using a toric ellipsoid instead of best with sphere? I think Rajiv from Delhi put it up. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Dr.
Rajiv
Rajiv Mukherjee.
Ji.
Yeah.
Rajiv Mukherjee himself, a cornea specialist. Yeah.
Yeah, I know Rajiv. Hi, Rajiv. I don't know if you're hearing me now.
No, but, he can't.
Yeah. So basically, the thing is that for most of the corneas, we would like to see how far they deviate from a spherical surface. So particularly when you're looking at conical cornea, the greater the deviation from the sphere, the more worried we become. So that is why we use the concept of a best.
Srini, there was a question from some PG who's attending just now, that they lost your voice when you're explaining that IS ratio. So could you please say it again?
Yeah. So the I minus S, basically I is for inferior and S is for superior. In a normal cornea, which is reasonably uniform distribution of curvature and power, if you look at the inferior cornea, basically the machine looks at rings, I think 6, 7, 8, and 9. You look at 3 points on each of those rings. So you have circles from a Placido, isn't it? You have circles that go across the cornea. So essentially, you're looking at the mid-peripheral cornea. If you draw a line from 3 to 9, you're looking at the cornea below the line and the cornea above the ring. Machine comes certain points, the actual value and the value on the top. In a normal cornea, when you subtract I minus S, because the values are very close to each other, the final value will be very close to a 0. But in a keratoconus, most keratoconus are inferior. So as the keratoconus starts to evolve, the inferior cornea starts to bulge, and the power of the cornea, that is why you see that inferior red. So inferiorly, it will be red, so the power is generally higher than the superior, which is still green. So here, when you do an I minus S, you will get a positive value. So what the Rabinovi's data does, it does a normative database of 100 corneas. So it looks at the mean plus or minus standard deviation. Of course, if you did a poor corneal graph like I normally do, if you get a very poor graph, if you get a very steep inferior cornea because of your graft-close junction not being good, then again you will get a high I minus S value. So in the exam, if you're given a topography and basically you see an inferior steepening, if they ask you what this is, you should only say it's an inferior steepening. If they ask you what is the diagnosis, then you must say that you would want some clinical data to be given to you as well. Then if they tell you, no, this person is 23 years old, he's got basically itching, allergy, he rubs his eye, now he's coming with blurred vision and so on, then you can say it is possibly a keratoconus. Because it's just like showing you an X-ray with a shadow and asking you for a diagnosis. You must only say it's a shadow. You don't know whether it's sarcoid, you don't know whether it's a foreign body, you don't know whether it's a tumor. So don't make a clinical diagnosis based only on topography. But inferior steepening, by and large, it suggests something like a keratoconus in a non-operated eye.
Excellent. Thank you. Deepak, Deepak ji, you can take
over.
over.
We can go for the Dr. Tetial, sir. Deepak, we can go to next talk.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Meanwhile, Tetial sir will share his screen. One question from the PG: what is the advantages and disadvantages of SlimFlux technology?
Of SlimFlux technology, basically the advantage mainly is that you can look at the posterior corneal surface without having to look through the anterior corneal surface like the slit scanning, which is the OpScan does. So if you have a keratoconus where you have a distorted surface through which you're looking at the posterior surface, or a post-LASIK eye where you flatten the anterior surface, the posterior surface imaging is not very accurate. Whereas with the SlimFlux, because you're looking at it as a side profile, the data is very accurate. So that's the most important advantage.
So we invite now Dr. Jeevan Tetial. Everyone knows him. He is a professor in the RP Center, Delhi. He is a renowned cataract and refractive surgeon, internationally and nationally. So we request him now to go ahead with his next talk, laser refractive surgery.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur and Deepak, for inviting me for this interesting PG examination talk on refractive surgery. Okay. We had a wonderful talk from Dr. Srinivas Rao regarding topography. I think topography is one which is the invention of refractive surgeons basically for cornea people. If I look into evolution of refractive surgery, you all know, but it all started almost 100 years back. In 1930, it was, a Japanese surgeon, Dr. Sato, who started doing radial keratotomies for Japanese soldiers. Subsequently, there has been innovations, modifications, which led RK to go in background. And the lasers came into picture. In 1985, Theo Seller started doing PTK, and the LASIK in 1990. Subsequently, it got approval from FDA in 2000. Then we had SMILE, which is lenticle-based surgery. The first clinical results were produced by Secundo in 2008. In 2016, this procedure got approval from our US FDA. Since then, it has become one of the most popular surgeries for laser refractive surgery based on cornea. If you see the gamut of surgery which are done in cornea, is basically a surface ablation, and you have a flap-based surgery, which is LASIK, and now you have a lenticle-based surgeries. All three surgeries are still being done in different parts of the world. That indicates that laser-based surgeries on cornea for refractive corrections are all are predictable and safe. So let me take you through the important surgery, which is LASIK, which is laser-assisted in situ keratomiliosis, Basically, it is correction of refractive error by ablating the tissue after making the corneal flap. So the instrument used for that is microkeratome or a femtosecond laser to create the flap. The most important aspect of surgery in this particular group of laser ablative procedure is to make a very nice flap, which is predictable, safe for a patient. So we have two devices. One is a mechanical device, which is based on microkeratome, which makes the flap cut with a blade. And you have a femtosecond laser, which is laser-based photo disruption to create a plane of cleavage in the cornea to create a nice flap in these cases. So this is basic 4 steps of microkeratome use. First, we use a suction ring of desired size onto the limbus to create the pressure onto the eye so that you have a well-built pressure. And when the microkeratome runs onto the cornea, it has a smooth cut. Once you have a complete cut, you can lift the flap. This is a super hinged flap you can see here. Laser ablation done and the flap is replaced back. So this is a simple procedure which was being done, is still being done by many people using microkeratome as such. Which are the various microkeratomes being used in the past? It was Jose Baraka who started in 1960 and developed the keratomes for lamellar keratoplasty. And this gave a birth to a refractive laser surgeries based on a flap making. So we have 2 types of microkeratomes based on their way of moving. One is a linear movement that is translational, which gives a nasal hinge flap, or you have a rotating, pivoting type of pendular microkeratome, which gives a superior hinge flap. But now, considering the fact most items can be disposable, you have a single-use keratome blades and heads also to decrease the complication in these cases. This is a nice compiled chart on a various types of keratome being used in the past. These are first and second generation keratomes, which can give you right from 120 to 180 thickness of flap in these cases, and different size ranging from 8.5 to 9.5 can be a suction ring to give access to ablation for a myopic correction, myopic astigmatism, or a hyperopic correction also. You have third generation pendular keratomes also, which gives you a very nice thin flap also, 90 micron flaps, much safer, and that can give you a much more corneal thickness to play with for cases with thinner cornea, with normal corneal topography, which Dr. Rao stressed for a diagnosis or taking away patients with early keratoconus for refractive procedures. So that was microkeratome based femtolasic procedures. And the invention was lasers to give a more precise, more comfortable flap for our patient who are undergoing LASIK procedure. It was Intralave started with the femtosecond laser way back in 2001. And subsequently, it was modified to give a low energy, high frequency ablation to the femtosecond photo disruption to the cornea to create nice flap in these cases. So they had a sequence of change from 2001, 3, 5, 6, and 8 now. The latest generation femtosecond devices can give you a various advantage of making good flap. You can see it ranges from 150 kilohertz to 500 kilohertz, the Visumax machine. And you have a third generation system from GMA, which can give you a sub-Bowman's access of 90 micron flaps. To give you, it can give you a very nice, well-controlled flap making. This is a typical picture from a femtosecond laser. This is from a wave light. First makes a tunnel for a gas to escape, then makes a flap cut. You can lift the flap and subsequently ablate and put the flap back in these cases. The surgery is simpler, more predictable as compared to microkeratome. If you compare microkeratome versus femtosecond laser, there's a more precise cutting of a flap in these cases. So once you have most precise flap cutting, predictable, less complication to a flap, and you have lesser chances of dry eye, lesser sensitivity to cornea, and lesser chance of infection also. So this is what you see in a diagrammatic representation. The femtosecond creates a very nice uniform flap. The thickness from periphery to center is uniform. So it's a planar type of flap. Therefore, the induction of higher order aberrations after flap making is minimal with femtosecond laser, which may not be true in a microkeratome flap, which is thinner and more irregular, like a meniscus type of flap in these cases, where you can have induction of a higher order aberration. So that's a clear advantage of a femtosecond use to make a flap. And the ablation profile is similar in both. It is D flap which makes a difference in these cases. See how much variability it can give you. If you use a keratome for making flap, if you take 140, the range can be 104 to 64. The huge range deviation can occur in these cases. And femtosecond gives a more predictable cut, which can range from 4 to 18 microns. In our practice, it doesn't go beyond 5 to 8 microns difference of your calculation. If you look into your calculation of residual bed thickness nowadays, it is totally based on a flap thickness and the amount of tissue removed. So if your flap thickness is not correctly coming with the keratome, then you can get haywire complication in these cases. The femtosecond laser does have some complications, like you have a little bit of bubble creation, which can make a bubble, opaque bubble layer. Application laser can be difficult sometimes in these cases. People say in earlier femtosecond laser, there used to be a DLK, which was quite common. Now it is not seen at all. While microkeratome, you all know it can give you a regular flap, sometimes free cap also, buttonholing, epithelial defects, which is very common with the blade which is running onto the cornea, especially if you put a lot of paracrine onto the corneal surface. Interface complications are very common with microkeratome blades. Infections, you all know, can be there. Flap stria is not very common nowadays, but we still see the range. It can be less than 1% nowadays. Well done cases. This is one of my case where patient came to me after 24 hours of surgery. You can see the clear flaps are visible here. You need to dilate the pupil to see the orientation of flap. You can see a little bit of a decentration of flap is there. So this happens normally with cases with physical trauma. The first thing is, in such cases, is to remove the epithelium from the surface. You can see I'm removing the entire epithelium. Don't dislodge the flap at this stage. Remove the epithelium almost entire 360 degrees. Once you remove the flap, then you can iron out the flap from external surface if it is within first 24 hours. But if it is after 48 hours, it's very difficult to get rid of these folds. And you have to lift the flap, hydrate the flap sometimes, and iron out from both sides, anterior posteriorly, to create a smooth bed. So sometimes in long-standing cases, people may have to put sutures to iron out this flap, and sutures should be put in a perpendicular to the folds in these cases. Infection rates have decreased, but they're still there with microkeratome use, especially with multiple uses. And we all know it's very common to have atypical microbacteria. Fungal infections are also very common with LASIK procedures. While femtosecond laser will have a lesser chances of epithelial ingrowth also, and better adaptability of patient and surgeon in terms of comfort wise. So if you look into various results, we all know anatomically and physiologically femtosecond will be better than cases with the microkeratome. There are few specific complications can be there with femtosecond laser ablation. One is femtosecond flap creation. One is intracameral bubbles. So once these bubbles are there, tracking becomes very difficult, and so your surgery may have to be delayed or postponed for some time. And it can give you a large area of opaque bubble, and that can be sometimes can give you a poor post-op outcome in these patients. Sometimes the gas can break anteriorly. This is anterior breakthrough can happen, and you may have to do a surgery after 3 or 6 months once the surface stabilizes. And best surgery at this stage will be a PRK for a patient. So these complications are related to flap making, mainly in the LASIK procedure. Little bit on a type of ablation we do for our LASIK patients. You all know we have a wavefront optimized ablation, wavefront guided ablation, and now people talk about Contura vision or a topo guided ablation for these patients. So if you look into all these ablation, they all correct lower order ablation, sphere and cylinder, while wavefront optimized will give you a minimal induction of a spherical ablation. It doesn't take care of existing aberration, but it doesn't induce aberration after you ablate the cornea in these cases. Where wavefront guided patients, they do have certain higher order aberration to begin with. And once you do a wavefront guided ablation, that will take care of the induction of aberration as well as pre-existing aberration also. The outcomes will be better. While topo guided Contura system takes away the abnormal corneal topography is picked up, and it treats the peripheral aberration of these cases. So these are a new way of thinking how and how much wavefront analysis should be done for a patient undergoing refractive laser procedures and how much should be corrected. Most commonly, people use wavefront optimized ablation. Wavefront guided are only left for those cases where you are higher, pre-existing higher order ablation. Topo-guided ablation or Contura, people say gives a better contrast, better vision. It is normally acceptable for all type of cases, but mainly for a compound myopic astigmatism, people take it. So this was for a LASIK procedure. It is still there. It has been there for 3 decades. Now something on a SMILE, that is a small incision lenticular extraction. As I said, the first clinical result came in 2008. In 2016, we had our FDA approval. It does have an advantage of lesser induction of dry eye, better ocular surface. Most likely, it can give you a better biomechanical stability also. So whenever we do a flap making, ablating the cornea to remove the corneal tissue, or taking out this lenticule, we are decreasing the corneal thickness. Indirectly, this may also be causing a decrease in our corneal hysteresis. Therefore, biomechanical strength of the cornea is important to decrease the future complications, dreaded complication named as ictasia. So we hope that the modification of laser ablative procedures might decrease the complication like ictasia in these cases. The basic difference, as you saw in a LASIK, is we raise the flap and then ablate the tissue and put the flap back. While in SMILE, we don't raise the flap, we just make a pocket and take out the desired tissue after making a lenticule with a femtosecond is taken away. But just now, it is not available for hyperopic treatment. There has been a lot of clinical trials going on now. Very soon, it will also be applicable for a higher amounts of astigmatism as well as for hyperopia subsequently. Let me briefly cover the various aspects of refractive surgery in terms of selecting a patient. The first thing is decision making, which patients are suitable for surgery or which patients are not suitable for a refractive procedure. To understand a little bit of machine and laser parameters and the surgical technique. Patient selection wise, as Dr. Rao has rightly picked up, you need to have a good ocular examination and investigation, especially topography, to rule out hidden cases of keratoconus or form of first-stage keratoconus, so that these patients doesn't land up in the full-blown keratoconus after the ablation of cornea in these patients. The last one is very important, the patient counseling. In fact, any refractive procedure, it may be PRK or a LASIK or a SMILE or any other type of surgery, we need to do a very comprehensive workup, and the counseling of these patients are very important. Any patient who has a high risk for a physical contact sports or a trauma, which can happen, like people working in armed forces or a police, they might take up the procedure which gives the most safety, like SMILE, where we do not make a flap. The flap related surgeries will have a higher chances of a contact dislodgement of a flap in these cases. Systemic and ocular examination similar for a LASIK, PRK, and SMILE. The FDA approval for cases for a SMILE would be up to less than -8 diopter, but if you see a CE approval, it is almost up to 10 diopter, 3 diopter cylinder. Can be corrected by a SMILE procedure also, not for hyperopia just yet. These are various topographic indices which should be taken before you look into suitability for patients. First of all, do a good topography, rule out hidden ectasia, form of ST keratoconus in these patients. Pachymetry is also very important. Any cornea less than 480 may not be suitable, or a residual belt thickness less than 280 or 300 nowadays may not be suitable for a LASIK procedure or a SMILE procedure. And check contrast of patient, abrometry, so that you pick up a higher order ablation of these patients. So one of the most important factor we take nowadays is percentage tissue altered after we do a ablation or we take a lenticule out. The only difference in a SMILE procedure will be we are not making flap, so we are making we are going to calculate by lenticule thickness, which has been calculated at nomograms, and the cap thickness, which is divided by the cornea thickness, will give you a PTA. Anything more than 40% PTA, patient is not suitable for a laser ablative procedure. The machine wise, as I said, this is a femtosecond laser, 500 kilohertz. The basic mechanism is a photo disruption. It forms of femtosecond bubbles, and these bubbles coalesce to form a cavitation bubble, and they separate the tissue without causing damage to the surrounding structures. So that is one of the best way to look into making a split in the corneal lamellae, so that you can have a very nice dissection of tissues, forms a flap in these cases. This is a SMILE machine by Zeiss. You can say patient bed, very comfortable here. Then you have a uninterrupted power supply available for these patients. Very nice microscope to give you a stereoscopic view for your patients. And fiber laser technology, therefore the air conditioning or management of OT is simpler than other LASIK systems. Individual contact lens calibration for each patient or each treatment, each eye is required, and the suction is lighter onto the cornea. Therefore, the patient can see during the suction also. The contact lens applicator, which is used for a SMILE, can be in 3 sizes. They are a small, medium, and large size, and these sizes are picked up based on a white to white. Normally, for Indian or Asian eyes, we normally pick up smaller ones because rarely we have a larger white to white for our patients. The white to white should also be measured before you pick up the suction contact lens applicator for these patients. The suction pressure buildup in a SMILE is least as compared to the other interlace Jamer machines. Therefore, as I said, you can still see patient fixing onto the green light, which is so important for getting a good pupil-centered treatment for SMILE patients. These are various applications which are available, right, from the SMILE, flap, circle, keratoplasty software, as well as intra-corneal ring segment software are also available for treatment in this particular machine as such. The major advantage getting into a lenticle-based surgery, as far as I'm concerned, is decreasing the amount of cornea which is being cut. If you look into a LASIK procedure, we are cutting almost a 270 degree of cornea, leaving only 30% which is not cut. While SMILE, we just cut at one area which ranges from 2 to 4 millimeter. So we safeguard the large number of cornea not being cut through the vertical orientation of a corneal stoma. So that is going to decrease the damage to the nerve fiber plexus. Maybe it decreases the ocular surface changes in these cases. So basically 3 ways. One is docking the patient with the appropriate contact lens, then the application of laser to create the lenticule, then the surgical aspect of a surgery where you have to dissect out the lenticule and take it away from the pocket, and the patient is subsequently managed post-op in a different manner than a LASIK patient, which I'll come to later. So basically you have 4 applications here. The first one is laser is placed to create a lenticule, then your lenticule side cut, then there's a flap cut, which is around 110, 120 microns, and subsequently the side cut to dissect out and take out the lenticule out from this patient. So if I show this video, you can see this is the patient bed and the laser machine orientation. Patient is placed and the suction ring is placed, and the contact lens is placed on the system to for each eye there has to be a new contact lens. Once we place onto the cornea, suction is generated. You have to make sure the application is around 80 to 90% before you initiate the suction in these cases, and the entire treatment is pupil-centered treatment. So that's the advantage here. We have no can say adjustment of cyclotorsion in these patients. So we are doing a treatment for a pupil-centered treatment. The future innovation will be taking care of a cyclotorsion in these patients also, especially for the astigmatic treatment. The first is the lenticule cut, which start from the periphery to center, or a spiraling tap for laser. Once that is completed, then make a flap which will come from the center to periphery. You can see it is again spiraling from a center to periphery one. This completes the flap making. Then last will be a side cut here, which is 4 millimeter. The suction is automatically released after you complete the procedure. Then patient is shifted towards a microscope, and the bed moves towards a microscope. You can see here. So once you can see that classically, you can see this is the lenticule S, this is the cap S. Once you take out little bubble, the things become more clear. So this is a cap cut, this is the lenticule cut. So you have to dissect out first the incision, which will make things more clearer. Once you have an incision cut, normally in a beginner, we normally choose 4 to 5 millimeter cut. So first we dissect the left hand side for right hand surgeon to dissect out the cap from the lenticule first. So this is the anterior dissection. Then towards the right hand side, do a posterior dissection to create the lenticule separation from the base. You can see this is posteriorly. You can see this edge is very clearly visible. Subsequently, we can do an anterior dissection with spatulated spatula. People use a different types of instrument to dissect out this. Idea is to do a very smooth dissection from center to periphery and go posteriorly subsequently to dissect out the lenticule. The complete separation should be done 360 degrees so that entire lenticule can be taken away without too much of a difficulty in terms of intra-pocket dissection should be minimal possible with dissector or with blades or with forceps. But sometimes these forceps can be a difficulty creating because they can get stuck to the wound area and you can have complication related to that. It has a slit limb attachment, also slit beam. You can see with the slit limb the entire area. In case any debris, you can take away those debris also. Many people do a irrigation of a lenticule bed also, which I normally don't do, which is not required also. So this is how a patient looks like day one. The day one, if you see, this is an OCT picture, clean cornea, no inflammation. The patient normally do well. So this is a day one picture. Patient comes smiling on a next day. That is the beauty of smiling patient, going smiling and coming smiling next day, which is so important. While LASIK patient, they can have pain, irritation for the first 24 hours, and outcome can be a little different in these cases. So this is after 1 week. You can see at 1 week also, both a clear circle can be visible. But if you see retroillumination, very smooth interface in these cases. This is the OCT picture, the same. So I have described a microkeratome femtosecond based LASIK procedure and the SMILE technology where we make a pocket and take out the lenticule based on the amount of refractive error. The lenticule thickness is created. The advantage of SMILE and microkeratome, I'll discuss in a briefly what is the difference and what would have a better advantage. So in terms of precision of refractive outcome after these procedure, it seems to be a similar visual outcomes of both LASIK and SMILE. But various studies have shown that the higher order induction or aberrations are less with a SMILE, especially if you see these patients from 6 months to 1 year post-op refractive correction. So that's the advantage of SMILE. Visual recovery wise, you would have heard many people saying SMILE patient recover slightly late or delayed, but it all depends how effective your laser application was there, how easy your dissection, how smooth your dissection was there in these patients, or how difficult black spots were there in these patients. That will make a difference. So easy dissection, better laser application gives you a similar outcome in day one with SMILE as the LASIK patients. And the higher the refractive error, larger the lenticule. So sometimes they can a little delay response of recovery to 6.6 in these patients. But with long-term results, they are equally good. And in fact, people say SMILE do better in the long terms. Other important consideration was ocular surface and dry in these patients. If you see here in LASIK patients, we cut almost more than 280 degrees. We have got all the nerve plexus all around. While SMILE, you can still save the nerve plexus and the recovery will be better. This is a picture from one of my patients. You can see this is a SMILE patient. This is a femtosecond LASIK patient. Pre-op, they're almost similar. At 1 month, there are hardly any nerve plexus visible in a LASIK patient. At 6 months also, see the difference between a SMILE and LASIK patient. The nerve plexus, which are seen as sub-basal level, they are far better in a SMILE. Therefore, the ocular surface would be better in a SMILE patients. Biomechanical stability, which I talked about, is definitely better with the SMILE patients. Basically, the vertical transaction of collagen lamellae, which happens in LASIK patients, is much more than a SMILE patient. So you preserve more peripheral lamellae, which is so important to have in the anterior part of the cornea, which is a stronger and the healthier part of the stomal tissue. If you preserve anterior cornea, your corneal strength will be much better because the corneal strength is basically in the anterior part of the stroma rather than the posterior part of the stroma. So that's a very important aspect. Despite playing in the same depth, both LASIK and SMILE, the tissue which is removed in the almost similar plane, but still we have a better hysteresis of cornea in SMILE cases. No flap related complication in SMILE patients, therefore less induction of aberration for patient with the cases of SMILE. Pupil size, many people do have a slightly larger pupil, especially Europeans or Western people, they have a pupillary size more than 6.57 millimeter. The larger pupil patients do better in SMILE than a LASIK, because SMILE we don't have a transition zone. The area of ablation is uniform in a SMILE, and the corneal flattening which happens after SMILE is much smoother, much larger in a uniform way than a LASIK patients. So this is some concern or retreatment after SMILE patient, but we do have various options. We can do a surface ablation in these patients, or a circle pattern if you have a larger residual refractive error. If you've gone through a 120, 130 cap thickness, then you can do a thin flap LASIK in these patients also. So there are various literature come up to treat these patients in a sequential manner also for a retreatment. While LASIK, we know that it has been there for a long time. We know all the tricks of how to manage post-LASIK enhancement wise also. For SMILE also, now we'll have better options. We do have, and we hardly have to retreat our patients in SMILE. So in terms of decision making, I think SMILE, mild ocular surface disease patient will be more suited than a LASIK patients, while patient with a high refractive error, better suited for SMILE patients. Contact sports, SMILE, yes. Hyperopia, only LASIK or PRK nowadays. Very high astigmatism, again LASIK and PRK. Post-refractive surgery enhancement, PRK would do better, or a Contura vision treatment will do better. SMILE does have a steep learning curve, as we realize when you get up to the learning SMILE, when you acquire new systems, at least 50 to 80 hours experience is required to attain some sort of a surgical confidence in SMILE patient. But nowadays we have wet labs, a lot of videos which are available to look into, and that makes life simpler. This is my first 50 cases, 100 eyes, where we did have some problems, problems, which basically would be manageable in all cases. The major problem is a suction loss in these cases, where surgery can be totally abandoned, or you can do resurgery depending on what stage you have a suction loss in these patients. The various algorithms are there. I think I've seen many SMILE surgeons, many students, we inquire on a SMILE, sir, what's the most difficult part in the SMILE procedure? I think the major difficulty people are facing is identifying the correct orientation of cap lenticular position and getting into a proper plane of dissection of these patients. If you see here, my blade is right in the anterior plane while dissecting. As I said, first we like to dissect the anterior, then go posterior. In that way, you have a total lenticule free from the pocket. And you can easily take out this. The major problem happens once you miss out the dissection, you go and posteriorly first, or you are anterior, but posterior you can't get in a proper plane. And we know that the lenticule thickness is never big. It's just a few microns. So that you have to understand subsequently. If you do not dissect the anterior posterior plane correctly, then you have all these complications, and that can create a poor outcome in these patients. But majority of time you can identify them. In difficult situation, you can do anti-segment OCT immediately and see where your flaps are, or you orient yourself in a surgery wise. As I said, for beginners, first you dissect anteriorly towards the left hand side, then dissect posteriorly for again giving a posterior dissection. If you see here, once you are doing an anterior dissection, the circle is not visible here. If you don't see the ring, that means you are posterior to the lenticule posterior surface. If you are anterior to the lenticule, the ring will be still visible. And if you nudge this anterior dissection, you're going to create a little meniscus. So that tells you that you have dissected lenticule both anterior and posterior. You can see here very clearly, this is anterior dissection. Then you can be, this is a posterior pocket formation. My dissector is underneath the lenticule. You can see the dissector here and the line above this. So that tells you I'm in the correct posterior orientation in these cases. So once you have these understandings, surgery becomes very, very simple. Like this particular case, I had dissected the posterior first. I'll go a little faster here. So I'm trying to dissect. I've dissected the entire, and I thought I'm dissecting anteriorly, but it was posteriorly. If you see, this is the initial dissection. I had created a little bit of meniscus here. In the beginning only, I have gone posteriorly, which I missed out. If I would have seen that, then my dissection would have been easier. Now what to do at this stage? Take a sharper instrument there and just nudge this anteriorly to make this little meniscus here, or this edge can be lifted away from the cap. You can see I have already made little bit of this. Then go anterior to that, dissect out as routinely you do for your patients, right from a center to periphery, and make sure your dissection is proper. So never get worried. Make sure you reassess yourself. Entire lenticle can be just taken away like a single piece of a mass also. So this is what dry eye will be less in a SMILE patient because of better management of nerve plexus in these cases. I have seen only one patient with epithelial ingrowth that was operated the outside. You can see here in a SMILE patients. So epithelial ingrowth is very, very rare in case of SMILE as compared to the LASIK patients, where it is much more often, especially when you have done a relifting in a LASIK flap, the chance of the epithelial ingrowth is much, much more. And the epithelial ingrowth is progressive, coming towards the visual axis, then you have to manage these patients as early as possible. The SMILE patient, I've seen, they are normally seen near the your incision area. As soon as you see these epithelial cells, the first thing is you should go immediately and scrape out these epithelial cells from the incision area. Don't wait in these cases, let it go to inside because they are normally in the peripheral area and they easily can be taken away with the reverse Sinskey hook. This is our study where we looked into various aspects of SMILE versus femtosecond LASIK. We had 40 eyes in two groups. We looked into how a SMILE or femtosecond will make a difference. The primary, we looked for visual acuity and visual quality. Then we checked the ocular surface, corneal biomechanics, and the nerve fiber plexus with confocal microscopy in these cases. So we know that there was a significant difference in the SMILE group. They had a better, in terms of a lesser higher order aberration than our patients with femtosecond LASIK. Same thing, we had a better corneal nerve fiber density in case of SMILE. Corneal hysteresis was less in case of LASIK patient compared to SMILE. And the ocular surface stability looked into tear breakup time and summers were better in SMILE patients. So our study also had a similar result, which is then a literature. You can see a literature showing the similar results. Femtosecond LASIK better than a microrectome LASIK, but SMILE outperforms femtosecond LASIK. If you see your patient, this was a 1 year follow-up for our patients. At 1 year, we did have a better quality of vision, better corneal biomechanical support, and better ocular surface the SMILE procedure. So this tells us this SMILE or lenticle-based procedure is the future surgery for us. And maybe more surgery should be done based on these basic criteria. So if you compare in terms of consolidated picture-wise, SMILE safety is much better, flapless, better for people who have a contact sports or people who are in armed forces or in police type of jobs. Very decreased or a reduced incidence of ectasia, though there has been few reports of ectasia in case of SMILE also. Sometimes we go the idea that we have a better biomechanics with a SMILE. We tend to go in a cornea with little compromise. That's why the refractive surgery concern never compromise on our parameters. You're going to have some patient will have a complication and that will ruin your entire practice. They never compromise on parameters on a refractive surgery as such. Reduced dry eye is a major concern because most of our patients do have a contact lens who are coming for refractive procedures. They already have a compromised ocular surface. The surgery per se will definitely induce dry eye in these cases, and dry eye treatment has to be prolonged in patients who have a significant ocular surface disorders. In SMILE, LASIK, both group of patients would require lubricants for longer period if patient is symptomatic. LASIK, I think the major advantage is the retreatment here. So I would summarize the SMILE, which is a new procedure, does make a difference in the refractive practice where you're doing a laser-based procedure onto the cornea. At present, though it is not a replacement for a LASIK because there are patients where LASIK may still be required. As I said, hyperopia, very high astigmatism, or patients who require contour vision treatment, LASIK is still the choice of surgery in those cases. Future will depend on how the results of SMILE, especially the retreatment rates, the ectasia factor, or the hysteresis factor in these cases, will make which will be the better choice of surgery for our young patients. Today, if I see my practice, SMILE we have been doing for last 4 years, it does give you a very good results. I have yet to take a single patient for retreatment after SMILE procedure. So there we have a better understanding of patients, of suitability based on our refractive error, based on our age, based on our biomechanical strength, based on a topographic picture, and the surgery wise also we are better off, better training, better systems, better machines, and the results are far, far better. I think people should go for refractive surgery for our young patients. The younger generation interested for reading books or videos, this is our book on a SMILE. In fact, this is one of the first book in the world on a SMILE and has a very nice video attachment of these cases. Thank you for kind listening for this talk.
Thank you, sir, for wonderful and elaborative talk. And best thing is 948 residents are here, those who logging and getting benefited from this talk. Now I request Direct sir to modify
Dr.
and
Jeevan.
ask questions from the PTL sir.
Dr. Jeevan, again, a very informative talk, not only for PG, but for all of us. Dr. Amrish, can you ask the questions to Dr. Titial?
Titial sir, very excellent presentation. Very informative. There are 2-3 most interesting questions are raised. One of the question was, how do we manage the suction loss? One important question for SKR sir.
He is not here.
SKR sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sir is there. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Amrish.
SKR
I
sir,
can't hear you at all.
superb presentation. There was one query regarding this Scheimpflug imaging. There are 2 thoughts, like having a single camera in Scheimpflug image device, or in Galili they claim that 2-camera Scheimpflug imaging. Is there any advantage or disadvantage of this technology, or having a single camera or double camera, as raised by Dr. Rajiv?
Basically, like I said, I'm not a technical person, so I'm not a physicist, I'm not an optical person. So I'm trying to basically cover the usage of this technology. I personally use the Sirius machine from CSO, but I understand that the Pentacam, I've used that as well. I've not really had a chance to use the Galili output. I think most of these machines are about the same in terms of the data they give you. They just have small variations. One is slightly better in some ways, the other is slightly better in other ways. But I personally think, unless you're somebody who's deeply into research on these things, for us, we should basically understand the device that you are working with. If it's a Sirius for me or if it's a Pentacam for you, we must understand everything about that machine and then use the data that it provides us in our patient care as much as possible. So, like I said, I'm focused more on interpreting this data. If you're asking me about the machines themselves, I wouldn't really have an answer for you. I'm not, too much aware of the constructional issues of these machines. Sorry.
And from clinical point of view, is there any advantage of having?
Correct. I ask you questions. If Dr. Titial, can you hear us? Amrish, there are 2 questions you can ask. You can reply.
Yeah.
So, if PG want to know what is white to white.
Okay. Yeah, white to white measurement is from, say, basically it's limbus to limbus measurement about the corneal diameter, which is slit scan or Pentacam. Whatever we measure, it's a measurement of limbus to limbus diameter measurement.
Okay, sir. Okay. Titial sir, one question for you: how to manage the suction loss in the SMILE? Tips to prevent the suction loss in the SMILE.
Question: any systemic factor to be ruled out before refractive surgery? Amrish and Dr. Shashi Kapoor.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Yeah, he's here. Amrish has come. Amrish.
Yeah, Amrish would reply. Any systemic factor to be ruled out before refractive surgery?
In my practice of whatever we do, we usually should ask the patient of history of any previous surgery or keloid formation, because these are the patients where you get a regression. very fast in those cases and don't get the rewarding result in those patients.
Katyal sir, can you get our
Katyal is not here.
This
Shashi, one
surgery-
question for yes,
Shashi
Deepak?
sir?
Yeah, one question for you. The herpes
Hold on.
patient, what is the best refractive surgery you would like to do in herpes patient?
Herpes patient.
Yeah.
Herpes patient, you have to be careful that it can get, reactivated. And I think you need to give a long interval before doing the surgery. And if there's scarring in the, central area of the cornea, I think it's avoidable.
Okay. If patient has dry eye, you have available before the surgery. Do you like to wait for the surgery, or you will go for the surgery and give treatment later?
No, in such
Dr. Trial, yes, welcome, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sir is there.
If patient already has, ocular surface problems or dry eye, the patient has to be treated. We recently has looked into all these patients. If you have significant problem, they should be put into a cyclosporin at least 4 to 6 weeks before trying to take them for surgery. Make sure you do their BOT Sharmas and see they are stable. Then take these patients surgery maybe after treatment. So if these cases normally should be counseled appropriately also. Otherwise, you're going to have a very, very predictable result subsequently.
Okay, sir. So next question is from Dr. Bhavya. She wants to know in SMILE how much astigmatism can be corrected.
No, the approval from a European CE is up to 3 diopter cylinder. That can be corrected, and only problem with the higher cylinder correction, as I told in the lecture also, it is sometimes you can have a little bit of axis orientation can be problem in these patients because you don't have a cyclotorsional adjustment in these cases. So the largest I have gone up to the 2.5 diopter cylinder.
And sir, LASIK surgery?
LASIK, you can go up to 4 diopters.
Okay, sir. Another question is from Dr. Nikhila. She wants to know, can we preserve the lenticule and insert it in the pocket in the cornea for hyperopic eyes?
No, I think people are talk about this, but there are various ethical issues also. Because you are taking a cornea from somebody, you need to have a proper assessment for these patients, especially for serological testings, consent from that particular patient for tissue to be preserved. Though Dr. Susan Jacob has described this technique for correcting hyperopia and even for a presbyopic correction also. But we are doing in a center where we're doing a cadaveric eye. We make a lenticule of that and using for these patients.
Dr. Titial, one question
Sir,
from
another-
Dr. Avantika.
Yeah.
If you have the availability of both LASIK and SMILE, for mild to moderate myopia, what would you like to do?
Just now, with the experience of outcomes of SMILE, I think SMILE will be a preferred choice for our patients.
For any type of myopia?
For a mild to moderate myopia, that's a good choice. The lowest myopia I've gone is minus 1 or 0.75 diopters. So you can correct up to a very small diopter also.
Sir, another question from all of our 3 speakers, Shashi sir, Darak sir, and you. What is your personal tip to prevent the suction loss in SMILE? For the
I think
beginners?
let Dr. Titial take this. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll because last year only we got a best video award from American Academy on a suction loss, where we produced and shown that every step of surgery you can have suction loss right from the beginning towards the end of side cut also. So suction cost is basically there are 2 important things. One is the patient. Second is the surgeon, who are 2 important factors to create suction loss in these patients. The patient has to you have to make patient understand the entire procedure which is going to happen for that 28 to 30 seconds when laser is being applied. The patient is not apprehensive, there's no chance of suction loss at all. It is a brief movement which patient does during your laser procedure. Suction loss can happen because the suction is so mild in these cases. With slight movement of eye, your suction can be lost. So I make sure I make the patient understand They're going to see a green light throughout the procedure, but towards the end of procedure, the light will be off. That is the most critical time where they don't have to look for a light. Otherwise, they'll have a suction loss. So make your patient comfortable, understand the surgical procedure. Second is the surgical bed. So if you have too much of fluid onto the ocular surface or in the inferior or superior cul-de-sac, the fluid will seep in and you can have a suction loss. So what I do, I make a cornea a little moist, but the entire inferior and superior sulcus are totally dry with the sponge. So once you have a dry ocular surface, the suction are better and chances of suction loss is also less. Third is making surgery a little faster, not let the patient lie down there for longer period, make him more difficult situation creating inside the machine, which is like putting a patient into the MRI machine, So faster surgery, make patient understand what is going to happen during your ablation and make them understand not to move the eyes so that you don't have suction loss. So if you have a suction loss, there's an algorithm which is there in the machine. It tells you proceed or not to proceed, and that's simple.
Dr. Titial, one question.
Sir, I have a question for you.
Yeah,
Amrish.
Yeah, Amrish.
Yeah, sir, how do you manage a retained lenticule, or say in case incomplete lenticular is removed, lenticule is removed?
And that's, I know, sometimes can be very, very tricky. That normally happens if your dissection has not been appropriate and you're trying to take the lenticule, your forceps, and try to rotate. And in that process, you can leave pieces, or sometimes you can have a small areas. And if it is a very small one, sometimes you might leave it because in the process of trying to remove, you can cause a total, cap tear and dislodgement of entire cornea also. In the recent time, what we have done, we have used fluorescein dye in one of patients to inject a fluorescein dye inside the cornea and see if you can pick up the area. Or in one patient, we have taken the patient to anti-segment OCT and see which is the area where you have the lenticule attached and try to dissect out that area and take it away. I recently had one case report. People have devised a technique was using the triamcinolone inside that cavity, and that delineates the lenticule and take it out. And if you have a larger lenticule, it's there for a longer period. You have to convert this to flap surgery subsequently. Make the flap, dissect out the remaining lenticule. If you have some residual error, that can also be corrected that time. So very difficult scenario. Don't try to take it out. Wait for some time, make a flap subsequently, and take the tissue.
Dr. Shashi,
can we get the same?
Dr. Shashi, there is one question for you. What are the chances of developing glaucoma in a smile patient post-operatively, and how to these are the IOP in such patient? Dr. Naila Aftab is asking you.
I think smile, let Titial answer, no? Smile, Dr. Titial should answer.
Thank you very much. Intraocular pressure, rise does happen in all myopic patients. We know that around 30 to 40% of all myopic patients can be steroid responders. Therefore, we need to judge these patients appropriately. If I see our patient, the SMILE and LASIK patient, the steroid which we give in a tapering dosage for 4 weeks. So, and the patient, we call them after 1 week and after 4 weeks. And that is the time we need to assess the intraocular pressure and see if they are high, they can manage. So sometimes intraocular pressure management can be difficult in these patients. The few important things which is to be seen in a patient who are coming to us. One is patient had a good vision in a first post-op day and comes back after 2 weeks or 3 weeks saying that my vision has gone down. Third is fluctuation of vision which can happen in these patients. And when the patient comes to you, see the cornea looks a little hazier or the transparency is less, immediately you should suspect intraocular pressure. Or sometimes there can be a toxic fluid collection also in the interface, especially LASIK patients. That should be checked appropriately, and the treatment can be totally different in these cases. The IOP management, basically, if steroid has to be decreased faster in these patients, in a steroid responder, and initiate anti-glaucoma topical medications for next at least 4 to 8 weeks so that pressure is controlled. Shashi, what's your take on this?
Which
So
tonometer
even
is efficient?
No, best is a ablation tonometer only, Goldman ablation tonometer. But immediate post-op, we don't like to immediately go for that. We normally do NCT for all our patients, and NCT reasonably gives you a rough idea of intraocular pressure. If it is very high, very low, NCT will not give you a good reading. In those situations, ablation tonometer should be done. But
Okay,
if you have other like Corbis, other things that can give you a good
Deepak, I think
titrated intraocular pressure.
yes, sir.
Satanshu,
Yes, sir.
Dityal was just asking about this pressure. I
Yes,
also give 3 weeks of steroids, and I think it's very rare to get a steroid responder, but we can ask everybody else, Ambrish and Dr. Rao, what is their preferred regimen for steroid, and any particular steroid or, FML or any stronger steroid. Ambrish or Rao?
Nowadays, I am preferring this loteprednol or FML, and we use it in tapering doses. And we normally cover the steroid course for 15 days. That's it. More than enough.
Dr.
So
Rao,
2 weeks.
Srinivas? Srinu?
And because
I use it for about a week. I do LASIK mostly, femto LASIK. I don't do SMILE as yet. So for me, it's 1 week of topical steroids. 1 hourly the day of surgery, 2 hourly for 2 days, 6 times for 2 days, and 4 times for 3 days.
Dr. Shashi,
Yes.
there's a question for you. Choice of refractive surgery for post-cataract residual refractive error, asked by Dr. Shruti.
So I think in this case, whether it is
I
LASIK,
think my internet
Keratom,
connection is
Femto-LASIK,
gone. I can't basically.
Femto-LASIK is not the issue. The issue is just getting the IOL power right, in which usually the readings from Pentacam, the EK holiday reports, and those are more important rather than whichever procedure you do.
Suppose patient has post, even after calculating everything, patient has post residual refractive error after cataract surgery.
Yeah.
What refractive surgery we like to do?
Yeah, then it will be better if you would have done a LASIK rather than a SMILE, because lifting the flap and touching up will be easier, or doing a PRK will be easier.
Dr. Retial?
I think what Dr. Shruti is asking, normally there are a group of patients where you have some sort of residual refractive error. That is would be mainly a cylinder which can create a problem for our patients after cataract surgery, especially if they have gone for a multifocal or trifocal lenses. But if it is a large amount of residual refractive error, the best idea will be exchange the IOL in such cases. But if I have to do a correction of a minor residual refractive error, that to cylinder, as Dr. Shashi Kapoor was talking, PRK would be a best choice for these patients, and that to a patient with a proper analysis. Make sure you wait for enough time after your surgery. Don't jump for correcting these patients within the first month. Wait for at least 2 to 3 months. Let cornea stabilize, ocular surface stabilizer, because you're putting a lot of medication onto the cornea. Your topography totally changes. Your refraction also changes. Wait for 3 months before you go for a refractive ablation onto the cornea. So either simple PRK or topographic PRK would be better for these patients.
Dr. Retial, for the high amount of refractive error left after cataract surgery, you said, less exchange.
Best if
Will you like to do the piggyback? Because less exchange itself is not a good, easy thing.
Yeah, let me explain again, Dr. Mathur. If I done a surgery, it's within the first 1 or 2 weeks of my surgery, where I can open my bag easily and bag is completely intact, no inflammation. We had an error of calculation IOL power in such patient. This can normally happen in a post-refractive surgery patients as such. Their best would be simply exchange the lens, because it's very easy to take out these foldable, if it is a foldable lens, and put another lens. But yes, if the bag has been there for longer period, there's a fibrosis, or your pseudophakia is not appropriate, posterior capsule is open, then that situation you can't do exchange in those cases. So case by case you have to analyze. If there's a long-standing case, fibrosis, you rightly said piggyback lenses are desirable. We have done for a multifocality also, we have done for a residual error in these cases. In fact, if you are not getting a proper piggyback lens, which are very costly, Recently, people have talked about putting routine ICL type of phakic lenses in those situations also. But there, make sure you have a good posterior chamber, good pupillary anatomy. Anatomy is good before you put these lenses.
Sir, another question is regarding the current scenario. How to go about the cataract surgery, refractive surgery during COVID era, and what are the precautions you all are taken?
Or you are doing it or not doing it?
There are very few people who have started doing refractive surgery. And I understand in Delhi, there are 1 or 2 centers they have started doing LASIK procedure also. Not in RP center yet, because I personally take it this is a truly a most elective procedure which can be there in ophthalmic scenario, and can be delayed for as long as possible till things are appropriate. As far as starting the LASIK procedure, I think this is the simplest surgery which can be started in a post-COVID area, because we have a normal, healthy young patients, and the OT requirements are different than OT requirement for a GA, which is difficult in today's time. It will be like a routine cataract OT with similar OT environment. People can do a LASIK procedure. We are not sure if the laser ablation can create the aerosol generation. We are not sure that. And that's the only consideration. The surgeon has to wear a N95 mask when they are doing this procedure.
Dr. Tetial, one question from the professor.
One question.
One question from the professor, not for the PGs. We all know BNR for the. He is asking antiviral treatment to be given how long? That's why this is not related to this talk, but you are a cornea specialist. He is asking for you.
No, sir. He wants to know for doing refractive surgery, if anyone is having viral infection, then how much time you give antiviral treatment?
So normally, if you have a patient history of herpetic eye disease, then refractive surgery should not be done, because you are either cutting the flap or you are ablating the tissue. The recurrence of refractive disease herpetic disease will occur, and your response will be haywire. So normally, if you have a known patient with a history of herpetic attack, we should not do a refractive procedure for that patient. By chance, your patient have undergone a refractive procedure because you sometimes don't have a telltale sign. In those situations, you can hope that, as routinely we do for cornea patients, the prophylactic dose should be given, 400 milligram BD for at least for 1 year for these patients, if not 6 months.
Sir, one question from someone is saying, I underwent for LASIK surgery for my myopia correction, now developing the presbyopia. So which is suitable for me? Which type of refractive surgery?
Sometimes, these LASIK patients are very lucky, because we know that cornea keeps remodeling, and there is some sort of resurgence of a myopia coming in these patients. And they do have a little myopia that gives advantage for near vision for some people. But if he's totally emmetropic at this stage and he's undergone LASIK procedure, then either he can think of doing a little bit of monovision type of correction for himself, or other laser ablation will not be possible in a flap which is there. So I would understand he has to wear the glasses, because the supracore, which may not be advisable for him, because that will create the another surface problems. Intracore, which was there earlier, is not being practiced nowadays. And the other option is Vizumex, which gives you a press beyond. So you have to be well adapted to a monovision first, because the other eye has to be 1.5 to minus 1.75 to have a good monovision press beyond procedure. So let him go to any refractive area, make sure he is adaptable to monovision, then go for press beyond, which may be suitable for him.
Ambrish sir, your opinion
I think
on
I am
this?
the best person. I am the best person to define that, because I have undergone LASIK, and simultaneously I have undergone the presbyopic surgery also.
Yeah, you are the best person. So what's your answer?
Dr. Tetial, yeah, Ambrish, your answer.
Your answer.
Answer. And from where you got it?
Amrish?
So I have undergone femto LASIK almost 10 years before, got my myopia treated, and recently, around 6 months back, I got my presbyope, supracore done. So
Supracore.
the same femto flap was relifted and supracore was done. And presently, I can tell you, I'm a very happy patient. The only condition which I feel is necessary is your corneal structure should be normal. Topography should be normal. That's it.
Dr. Tityal, one question for you.
Yeah.
Because of suction, is there any chance of detachment in refractive surgery?
Okay, I think a very good question. Maybe from a postgraduate point of view. Luckily, we do such a nice pre-op assessment for all our patients undergoing refractive procedure. The entire posterior segment is nicely, thoroughly checked if there's any weakness in the periphery or retina. But whatever studies we have done in the past also, recently also with SMILE and femtosecond LASIK, there is no addition onto the posterior segment changes with the suction ring which has been applied in LASIK and SMILE patients. So there has been no changes which has been there which can be contributed to a suction. So that's...
Yes, sir. Sir, one resident is asking if he has to retain Pentacam in a 5 marks question. What are the key points you advise him to retain for that theory? If there is a question in theory, Pentacam in 5 marks, so what are the things is supposed from the examiner point of view?
I think basically you should talk about the technology involved, the Scheimpflug principle, and then you can mention that the machine does what it does. It looks at anterior elevation, and basically the principles that I said about the elevation, how you calculate the actual values on the corneal surface using the best fit sphere. Then the data that it provides you in terms of anterior and posterior elevation, the pachymetry, the placebo, the based maps, and then its uses you can briefly mention. For 5 marks, I think that should be more than enough.
Okay, thank you, sir.
I think the clinical application of a system has to be brought out. So it has, apart from the corneal assessment, both anterior, posterior, and pachymetry values, and making a refractive analysis for patients for a not suitability or suitability. It has other things also. It can give you the lenticular assessment also sometimes. You can look into a density of lens. That can also be helpful in a patient if you're doing some sort of research in your group of patients. People have looked into anterior, posterior capsule. People have picked up posterior polar in that. So that, especially Pentacam HR, this option is there. And now Pentacam can be with associated with Corvus, can give you a much more analysis.
Tityal sir, one question from Dr. Lita. She wants to know your tips how to proceed after opaque bubble layer if happens during SMILE.
Normally, a SMILE patient, you do have bubble formation. That normally happens in those cases where your appellation is not good or your surface has not been properly uniformly moistened. If you have a dry surface, you're going to have a dry spot when you do a SMILE procedure. So your cornea should be smooth and well moistened before you apply the contact lens. Sometimes you have a repeated application of contact lens that can also create the appearance of opaque bubble in these cases. The idea there is if you can have a very nice creation of incision, so incision opening, then you may have to have a little more dissection in those areas where you had an opaque bubble, where there will be some sort of additions. So the bimanual technique of holding the globe with your left hand or right hand, whichever hand you are using, then dissecting that area gently from center to periphery or periphery to center, and that can take away the small addition which may be there. In that regard, I normally prefer a spatulated dissector there, which gives a larger area of separation, and gentle procedure should be done. First, you can dissect out the normal area, then come to this addition area, and gentle manipulation like you do for a lamellar procedure. You can take nice care of that multiple black spots also. Sometimes there can be a diffuse islands of black spots in a difficult cases. There physically you have to dissect out sometimes. In that way, never make sure that your lenticule attached in some area. Don't let lenticule be separated totally from one side. The lenticule get flapped to one side, very difficult to dissect. You need to have a fulcrum attached to either side so that you can have a dissection in these difficult situations.
I have one question for SKR sir and Shashi sir. Shashi sir,
Yeah,
can you hear
Ambrish.
me?
Yeah, Ambrish, I can hear you.
In case of diagnosis of keratoconus, which technology will be more useful and accurate? Either it's a slit scan or a Scheimpflug imaging.
Slit scan, I think OpScan has developed a sort of a bad name for repeatability, and especially in pathologic corneas with advanced disease like keratoconus. Otherwise, diagnosing keratoconus, I think it makes no difference whether you've got an OpScan or any of the Scheimpflug things, you know. What about Dr. Rao? What would you think in that? Srini?
I agree. I think that's a correct answer. But for repeatability and for follow-up, probably the Scheimpflugs are better. But for basic diagnosis, I think even a Placido would do a good job for keratoconus. I don't think there's much difference between the slit scanning and the thing. You can do it with both. I agree with you.
Deepak, we are running out of the time now. So we would like to see Shashi, Dr. Shashi, to give your expert opinion about this, all the talks about both the talks. Dr. Shashi.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think I would like to thank Dr. Deepak Mishra on behalf of these 1,000 PGs today and many more who missed it, that in spite of so many webinars, nobody is targeting the PGs, and I'm sure they are really going to be grateful to him. And it's been a great time. Thank you, Dr. Mathur, for a great moderation, and all the speakers have made wonderful talks. Thank you.
Dr. Ambrish.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Ambrish.
Thank you.
Ambrish, sir, please.
I think that both the talks were excellent from PG point of view. There is a lot to learn, and I should thank Dr. Deepak and Dr. Mathur. Sir, it's a great initiative. Last 3-4 times I am regularly attending these seminars, these webinars, and there is a lot of information being shared amongst the residents. All across the country, residents are actually able to learn the theoretical as well as the practical part of it. So thanks to both of you for this great initiative.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
you, Tatyal.
I have a same views there. Both Deepak and Dr. Mathur have done a wonderful moderation of this session. In fact, today I've learned so much from Dr. Rao regarding corneal topography. One of the best talks I've heard now. I heard him in our ISCRIS meeting in Pune recent past. And this was a great opportunity to learn from him. Wonderful talk. And the discussion, the panel was Dr. Shashi, wonderful discussion on basics of a refractive procedure, topography. Whatever said and done, topography is one of the most difficult talk to understand, most difficult to implement in your practice also. So wonderful talk. I learned so much, and thank you, Deepak, for initiating a PG course type of education program. And you've been a good teacher for a younger generation. And we all keep learning from, all of us. And I understand such meetings should be there much more often. And maybe like you have taken today 2 speakers where they given up more than 40 minutes for a talk about. And Pentacam, I understand topography would require a 1 to 2 hours talk so that we understand each and everything. But Dr. Rao was wonderful today. Thank you again.
Dr. Tatyal, we request you to enroll your PGs in the PG forum. So that they can also get benefit in the future talks.
No, we also have our classes going on from the
Yes,
AIMS.
sir.
We have a AIMS facility also, and that can be log in by anybody. We can supply those links to everybody, and we are doing a regular talk
to our PGs.
So, Rao sir, Bharat sir, Sasi sir, Sitanshu sir, and Mr. Dr. Rohit and the Optho team who is supporting this webinar. And sir, luckily we crossed the 1,000. We reached up to 1,035, and only by the, it is not any show business, not on Facebook or YouTube. All have logging personally, and they are requesting more talk. I am getting continuous message that we want to hear both of you again. So we need your blessings for our future webinar too. I think Rao sir is still not connected. I will thank him personally on phone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, Dr. Rajesh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh, MD of this Optho Pharma. Please convey our thanks to Dr. Rajesh, Mr. Rajesh, and Dr. Rohit.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you, Rohit.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Bye-bye.